The snow was falling again that December night, silent, patient, and uninvited. Each flake drifted down like a forgotten prayer, landing upon the cold stone terrace of Harrison Manor, the grand home of Robert Harrison, a man once worshipped by fortune, now chained to despair. Inside, the vast mansion stood dimly lit, its marble floors gleaming faintly beneath golden chandeliers that no longer burned with purpose. It was a palace built to house laughter, but time had turned it into a museum of regret. Robert sat motionless in his wheelchair, facing the enormous window that overlooked his snow-covered gardens. His reflection, faintly visible in the glass, looked like a ghost, hair now streaked with silver, face carved by years of bitterness, and eyes that had long forgotten warmth. The hum of the heater was the only sound in the house, aside from the ticking of a grandfather clock, steady, mocking, eternal, the weight of the past 20 years ago. Robert had been a man others envied. He was the youngest CEO to lead Harrison Global Industries, a multi-billion-dollar technology empire that shaped the skyline of cities and the future of communications. His life had been an endless string of success, power meetings, champagne celebrations, photographs in glossy magazines, and beside him stood Diana, his radiant wife, graceful, adored, and seemingly perfect. Together they looked like destiny's favorites, but destiny is a fickle friend. One rainy night, Robert had been driving home from a charity gala, exhausted, half-drunk, arguing with Diana over something trivial, her spending, his pride, their distance. He never saw the truck speeding through the intersection. When he woke days later in a hospital bed, Diana's trembling hand was the first thing he saw. But the second thing, the one that shattered him, was the look in the doctor's eyes. "You'll live," the doctor had said quietly, "but your legs won't." Robert remembered the silence that followed, a silence so heavy it drowned out every other sound in the world. A prison built of gold now. 2 decades later, he still lived within that silence. He had dismissed almost all his staff, fired his driver, sold most of his art collection, and refused to see anyone but his nurse and accountant. The man who once commanded boardrooms now barely spoke to another soul. Money could still buy him comfort, but not purpose. He often stared at his hands, strong and capable, wondering why fate had spared them but not his legs. He loathed the sight of his wheelchair, that polished chrome reminder of everything he had lost. He despised the pity in people's eyes. He despised the whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. But more than anyone, he despised himself. When his wife left him 5 years after the accident, she didn't leave for another man. She left because she could no longer bear the man he'd become, angry, cruel, and broken. "You died that night, Robert," she had said through tears as she closed the door. "What's left of you is just money and misery." The knock in the silence on this particular night, the world outside was buried in snow. Robert sat alone near the fireplace that hadn't been lit in months. The air was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. He sipped from a half-empty glass of whiskey, his only companion. It was past midnight when a sound broke through the stillness. A knock, soft, timid, uncertain. Robert frowned. No one visited him, not at this hour, not at all. His nurse had gone home hours ago. The estate gates were locked. He ignored it, but then it came again. Knock, knock. Knock, gentle yet persistent, as though whoever stood outside believed that if they just kept trying, the door would open. "Who the hell?" Robert muttered, wheeling himself toward the sound. The hallway stretched long and empty, lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch him as he passed. He stopped before the heavy oak door. Snowflakes danced in the sliver of light beneath it. With a mechanical whir, he unlocked it and slowly pulled it open. The girl at the door, standing in the dim glow of the porch light, was a small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. Her skin was deep and rich like polished mahogany, her hair a tangle of curls dusted with snow. Her shoes were too thin for the weather. The left one had a hole near the toe. She looked up at him, not with fear, but with the kind of wide-eyed courage only hunger can create. "Good evening, mister," she said softly. Her voice was tiny, yet it carried through the cold like a bell. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was just wondering if you had any leftovers. For me and my mama." Robert blinked, certain he had misheard. "Leftovers?" "Yes, sir." "Food you don't need," My mom is still at work and we didn't have dinner tonight. Her small hands were bare, trembling. She hugged herself for warmth, but her eyes, those impossibly bright brown eyes, stayed fixed on him. Robert felt something stir inside his chest, an old ache he hadn't felt in years. "Where do you live?" he asked gruffly. She pointed toward the row of crumbling apartments across the street, barely visible through the snow. "Over there. Apartment 3B. We live on the top floor. Mama says someday we'll move somewhere warm." Her voice wavered slightly, but she smiled as if to keep hope alive. Robert glanced over her shoulder at the building. He had never really looked at it, the block of gray brick that faced his mansion. How strange, he thought, that he had spent 20 years trapped inside his own misery while just a few yards away, someone struggled to stay alive. "The Novardo wait here," he said finally, his voice softer than before. He turned his chair and disappeared into the kitchen. He hadn't cooked in years, and his meals were delivered daily, but there were always leftovers, untouched plates, half-eaten dishes that went straight into the trash. He wheeled over to the refrigerator, pulled out what he could find, some chicken, a loaf of bread, a slice of apple pie. He wrapped them carefully in foil, placing them into a small box. When he returned, she was still there, shivering but waiting patiently. "Here," he said, handing her the box. "Take this home to your mother." Her face lit up with gratitude that burned brighter than the chandelier behind him. "Thank you, mister." "You're very kind," Robert shrugged. "It's just leftovers, but the girl didn't take them right away." Instead, she looked up at him thoughtfully, her head tilted. "Can I ask you something?" Robert sighed. "What is it?" She pointed at his wheelchair. "Is it hard, not being able to walk?" The question hit him like a blow. For a moment, he wanted to snap at her, to remind her that such things weren't polite to ask. But when he looked into her innocent face, he couldn't. "Yes," he said simply. "It's very hard." She nodded slowly, then smiled. "My mama says sometimes people lose things so they can find something better. Maybe one day you'll walk again. Maybe a miracle will happen." Robert let out a humorless laugh. "Miracle, huh? I don't believe in those anymore." The girl's eyes glimmered. "Maybe that's why you haven't had one yet." He blinked, startled. "What did you say?" She smiled wider. "Miracles only happen to people who believe they still can." For the first time in years, Robert didn't know what to say. A promise in the cold. She took the box of food and turned to leave, but paused at the first step of the porch. "Thank you again, mister. Oh, and if you ever need a miracle, I'll give you one." Robert chuckled despite himself. "You? What kind of miracle could a little girl give me?" The girl grinned, her teeth white against the night. "You'll see. Maybe not today, but soon." And with that, she ran off into the snow, her small figure swallowed by the swirling white storm. Robert watched her go, a strange tightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt something. He didn't know what it was. Warmth, confusion, guilt, but it was alive. He closed the door slowly and sat in silence, staring at the faint footprints she'd left on his porch. That night he couldn't sleep. The girl's words echoed through his mind again and again. Miracles only happen to people who believe they still can. He hadn't believed in anything for 20 years, not in God, not in hope, not in humanity. But those words, spoken by a hungry little girl, haunted him like a melody he couldn't forget. Somewhere deep in his heart, beneath the ice that had built up over decades, something small began to thaw. The dawn. After the snow, the next morning, the world outside was blindingly white. Sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering diamonds across the snow. Robert wheeled himself to the window. The footprints were gone. He wondered if she had been real at all, or just another ghost haunting his lonely nights. But then, on his doorstep, he saw something small glinting in the light, a coin dull and old, with a worn engraving of an angel. He picked it up, frowning. On one side, someone had scratched a few words. "Believe again." He sat back, stunned. For a long moment, Robert just stared at the coin. Then, against all reason, he smiled, the first genuine smile in 2 decades. And though he didn't know it yet, that little girl's promise, "If you ever need a miracle, I'll give you one," was about to change his life forever. The morning after Jasmine's visit felt different. For 20 years, mornings had always been the same for Robert. Silent, mechanical, colorless. He'd wake, bathe with the help of his automated lift, eat alone in his grand dining hall, then retreat to his office to stare at nothing in particular until the sun went down. But that day, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The light seemed brighter, the air less cruel, and in his hand he held the tiny coin she had left behind. It was an old thing, bronze, maybe older, with an engraving so faint he could barely make it out. An angel, wings open, eyes closed. And beneath it a few unevenly carved words, "Believe again," the forgotten warmth. He couldn't stop staring at it. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was probably worthless, the kind of trinket you'd find at a thrift shop, yet holding it made him feel something unfamiliar, curiosity. It had been years since he'd felt curious about anything. He rolled his chair back from the table and wheeled toward the large window. Outside, the street was alive with movement. Kids threw snowballs. A mailman trudged through the snow. A few workers cleared the sidewalks. Across the street, the row of old apartments stood under the pale light of morning. He'd looked past them for decades, but now his gaze lingered. Somewhere in there, that little girl, Jasmine, and her mother were starting another hard day. He wondered if they'd eaten the food he gave them. He wondered if the girl's mother even knew what her daughter had done. And he wondered, strangely, if Jasmine really believed what she'd said, that miracles only happened to those who believed they could. A visit to the other side. By noon, Robert had made up his mind. For reasons even he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to see her again. He put on his coat, maneuvered his wheelchair down the ramp by the front door, and rolled toward the main gate. The icy wind bit at his face, but he didn't care. It took nearly 15 minutes to cross the street. The sidewalks were uneven and steep, the curbs unkind to his chair. He hadn't been outside his estate's boundaries in almost 6 years. When he reached the apartment building, he stared up at it in disbelief. The brick was cracked and stained, windows patched with cardboard, and the main door hung loosely from a single hinge. He hesitated. For a man who once hosted senators and CEOs, walking, or rather wheeling, into a place like this felt alien. But something stronger than pride pushed him forward. Inside, the narrow hallway smelled of damp plaster and cooking oil. The floor creaked beneath the wheels of his chair. Children ran past him barefoot, chasing a rubber ball, laughing without fear or shame. He stopped at a rusted staircase that led upward. A woman carrying laundry eyed him curiously. "Excuse me," Robert said. "Do you know a little girl named Jasmine Thompson?" The woman blinked, balancing the basket on her hip. "Jasmine? The one with the curly hair? Yeah, lives up on the 3rd floor, 3B, but the elevator doesn't work." Robert's heart sank. 3rd floor. He looked up at the steep staircase, feeling a cold stab of helplessness. He couldn't go any further. "Thanks," he murmured. She nodded and disappeared down the hall. For a long moment he sat there, frustrated, angry at his body, angry at the universe. He'd finally decided to do something different, to step out of his shell, and life had laughed in his face again. A voice from above. Then he heard laughter, light, bright, unmistakable. He looked up, and there she was. Jasmine was leaning over the railing of the 3rd floor, a faded pink scarf wrapped around her neck. "Hey, it's you," she called out, grinning down at him. "The man with the leftovers." Robert couldn't help smiling. "That's not a very flattering title," she giggled. "Sorry, I didn't mean it bad." Her voice carried easily through the stairwell. Other tenants peeked out of their doors, curious. A few whispered, probably wondering what a rich man in a wheelchair was doing in their building. "I was hoping to see your mother," Robert said. "Is she home?" "No, sir. She's at work. She works at the diner on 7th Street. Double shift today." He nodded slowly. "You must be proud of her." "I am," Jasmine said earnestly. "She's my hero." Robert felt a strange lump in his throat. Then Jasmine frowned. "But what are you doing here, mister?" "I wanted to bring this back." He lifted the coin she'd left on his porch. "You dropped it last night," her eyes widened. "Oh, you found it." "That's my lucky coin." "Lucky coin?" "Yes, sir. My grandma gave it to me before she passed away. She said if you give it to someone who needs hope, it works like a wish." Robert's hand tightened around the coin. "A wish?" She nodded seriously. "But only if the person really wants it. You can't fake a wish. The coin knows. For a man who had spent his life in the world of science, logic, and money, her words should have sounded ridiculous. But somehow they didn't. The diner on 7th Street. That afternoon, Robert couldn't shake the thought of Jasmine's mother. He imagined her, out exhausted, working long hours, trying to feed a little girl in a broken neighborhood. He decided to find her. It took him most of the afternoon to locate the diner, Miller's Corner Cafe, a narrow place sandwiched between a pawn shop and a tire repair shop. The windows were fogged from steam, the smell of frying oil and coffee spilling into the street. Inside, the tables were full of truck drivers, janitors, and construction workers warming their hands over mugs of coffee. A waitress moved quickly between them, tall, slim, wearing a faded uniform and a tired smile. "Excuse me," Robert said as she passed. "Are you Jasmine's mother?" She turned, startled. "Yes, I'm Grace Thompson." "Who's asking?" "My name is Robert Harrison. Your daughter came to my house last night." Her eyes widened. "Oh God, is she what?" "Don't worry," he said quickly. "She didn't do anything wrong. She just asked for food. I gave her some." Grace's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. She shouldn't have bothered you. We've just had a hard month. Rent's late, the heater broke, and I haven't had time to fix things." Robert raised a hand gently. "Please, you don't have to explain. She's a wonderful girl." That made her pause. "She is," Grace said softly, pride flickering in her tired eyes. Robert hesitated. "If it's not too forward, maybe I can help." Grace stiffened. "Help? Look, I appreciate your kindness, but we don't take charity." "I'm not offering charity," Robert said quietly. "I'm offering opportunity. I run a few properties nearby. I could use someone reliable to help manage the accounts and maintenance." "You seem capable," she frowned. "Why would a man like you come all the way down here to offer me a job?" He smiled faintly. "Because your daughter told me something last night that I haven't been able to forget." Grace tilted her head. "What's that?" He looked down at the coin in his hand. "That miracles only happen to people who believe they still can." Grace's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something. But just then, her boss yelled from the kitchen, "Grace, order up!" She glanced apologetically at Robert. I'll think about it, Mr. Harrison." He nodded and turned to leave. The storm inside that night, Robert couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jasmine's face, smiling, confident, untouched by the cynicism that had consumed him. He thought of Grace's worn uniform, her tired hands, the defiance in her voice when she refused pity. He thought of the coin again, the angel, the words, "Believe again." And for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, belief itself was a kind of miracle. But his heart had been cold for so long that believing felt impossible. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, he wheeled himself to the old piano in the corner of the room. It was covered in dust, untouched since his wife left. He had once played for her every evening, small songs that filled their home with life. He stared at the keys for a long time, then pressed one. It let out a soft, trembling note, then another, and another. The melody was broken and awkward, but it was real. For a moment, Robert forgot his pain. The music seemed to stitch something torn inside him. And outside, across the street in a dark little apartment, a small girl named Jasmine stirred in her sleep and smiled. A new light the next morning. There was a knock at Robert's door again. He opened it and then froze. Grace stood there holding Jasmine's hand. Her eyes were cautious, but her smile was gentle. "I thought about your offer," she said, "and if it's still open, I'll take the job." Robert felt something inside him shift. A door opening after years of being locked. "It's open," he said softly. "Welcome aboard," Jasmine beamed. "See, mister? I told you miracles happen." Robert laughed, really laughed, for the first time in 20 years. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the coin meant anything or if Jasmine's faith could change the world. But for the first time in a long, long time, he wanted to find out. And far above the snow-covered rooftops, the morning sun broke through the clouds, spilling light over a mansion that had long forgotten warmth. The winter sun filtered through the frosted windows of Harrison Manor, bathing the grand hall in a pale golden glow. For the first time in decades, there was movement in the house, the kind that carried life instead of loneliness. Grace Thompson, dressed modestly in her winter coat, stood near the fireplace, carefully sorting through a pile of unopened letters, bills, and estate documents. She had started her new role as Robert's assistant just a week ago, and in that short time, the silence that once haunted these walls had begun to lift. From the corner of the room, Jasmine hummed softly, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, drawing something on a notepad, a small stick figure man standing on two legs beside a smiling little girl. Above them, she'd written in big wobbly letters, "Believe again." Robert, seated by the window, watched her with quiet amusement. "You've got quite the artist there, Grace." Grace smiled, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "She's always drawing. Says she's going to be a miracle doctor someday." Jasmine looked up. "Not just a doctor, Mama. I'm going to make people walk again, just like Mr. Harrison." Robert chuckled, though something inside him stirred uneasily at her words. "That's quite a dream, Jasmine." She nodded seriously. "Dreams are how miracles start." Grace shot her daughter a gentle look. "Sweetheart, don't bother Mr. Harrison with your stories." But Robert shook his head. "She's not bothering me." And truly, she wasn't. In fact, her presence filled a void in him he hadn't realized was there. A quiet, persistent light cutting through years of darkness. The forgotten smile as days turned into weeks, a rhythm began to form. Grace came by every morning to help manage his estate, organizing finances, paying overdue property taxes, sorting donations that had been ignored for years. She was efficient, humble, and kind. Yet there was an unspoken sadness in her eyes, one she tried to hide behind her tireless determination. Sometimes Robert would catch her staring out the window at the snow and wonder what memories haunted her. Once he almost asked, but the question lodged in his throat. Meanwhile, Jasmine became a daily visitor, her laughter echoing through the house as she played in the halls. She'd sometimes sit near Robert's wheelchair, talking as though they'd known each other forever. "Do you ever go outside?" she asked one afternoon. Robert hesitated. "Not much anymore." "Why not?" He gestured toward his legs. "Not much reason to," she frowned. "But the world's still beautiful. You don't need legs to see that." He couldn't help smiling. "You're too wise for your age, you know that?" She grinned. "Mama says Grandma used to say I was born with an old soul." Robert leaned back, thoughtful. Maybe she was right. The music returns one particularly bright morning. Jasmine discovered the old grand piano in the corner of the room. "What's this, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, brushing dust off the ivory keys. "That," he said, "was once my favorite thing in the world. Can you play?" "I used to." She pressed a key, giggling at the soft sound. "It still works." Robert wheeled himself closer. "Barely. Haven't touched it in years." "Then touch it now," she urged, clapping her hands. He hesitated, then slowly he placed his fingers on the keys. The first note was fragile, hesitant, but soon others followed. A melody emerged, uneven but alive, filling the room with echoes of forgotten joy. Jasmine watched in awe, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful." Robert smiled faintly. "It's called Clair de Lune. My wife used to love it." "Where is she now?" Jasmine asked innocently. He paused. "Somewhere. Far away." Jasmine nodded solemnly. "Maybe she'll come back when she hears your music again." Robert didn't answer. But for a moment the thought didn't hurt as much as it used to. The shadow of the past that night, Robert dreamt for the first time in years. He was standing in a field of golden grass beneath a setting sun. His legs were whole, strong. The wind brushed against his skin like an old friend. In the distance, a little girl waved, Jasmine, and beside her a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, Grace. Then the dream shifted. The field darkened, the sun swallowed by storm clouds. A car horn blared, metal twisted, and suddenly he was back in the wreck, trapped, screaming, unable to move. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The old pain in his back flared like fire. He pressed his palms against the armrests, trembling. "It's just a dream," he whispered. Just a dream, but deep down he knew something was changing inside him. For the first time in 20 years, his dreams had a pulse, and that meant his heart did too. The test of kindness. A week later, Grace came in early, her eyes red from crying. "Is everything all right?" Robert asked gently. She hesitated, then sighed. "They're raising our rent again. I don't know how I'm going to manage this time." Robert frowned. "How much?" 300 more. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're already counting every cent, he nodded, understanding. You can move into the cottage behind my estate. It's been empty for years. You'd be closer to work and Jasmine would have space to play. Grace's eyes widened. Mr. Harrison, I can't accept that. You can. And you will. It's not charity. It's fairness. You've done more for me in the past month than anyone has in 2 decades. Tears welled in her eyes. Thank you. Jasmine, overhearing, ran up and hugged Robert's arm. See, Mama? I told you he's a good man. For a moment, the sound of her laughter filled the house. Bright, free, unstoppable, and in that laughter, Robert realized something he hadn't dared to admit. He cared about them. Deeply. The Miracle Begins days passed, and something remarkable began to happen. Robert had always lived with constant pain, sharp, unrelenting, a reminder of what he'd lost. But one morning, as he reached for a cup of tea, he realized the pain had dulled. Not gone, just quieter. At first he dismissed it as coincidence, but it continued. Each day the pain lessened. The stiffness in his legs began to ease ever so slightly. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, Jasmine asked, "Can I see your legs, Mr. Harrison?" He blinked, startled. "Why would you want to see that?" She smiled. "I just want to say something to them." He hesitated, then sighed and lifted the blanket covering his legs. Jasmine knelt, placed her small hand gently on his knee, and whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she looked up at him and said softly, "They just forgot how to believe in walking. You have to remind them." Robert's throat tightened. "You really think that's possible?" Jasmine nodded with certainty. "You told me you used to run, so your legs already know how. They're just sleeping." He couldn't help but laugh, but deep down a flicker of hope ignited. The coin's secret later that night. He took out the angel coin again. It glowed faintly under the lamp. For weeks he'd kept it close, a strange token of comfort. But as he turned it over, he noticed something new. The words, once faint and worn, seemed clearer now, as though etched freshly into the metal. "Believe again." The engraving shimmered faintly, almost alive. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when he blinked, the glow was still there. Subtle yet undeniable. His hands trembled. For a man of logic, it should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with wonder. Miracles only happen to people who believe they still can. He whispered. And for the first time, he did. The unseen witness across the hall, Grace, stood in the doorway, unseen. She had come to bring him his medicine, but stopped when she saw him, sitting there, smiling softly at the glowing coin. Something about the scene made her heart ache. She had seen him change these past weeks. Softer, kinder even. Younger somehow. But what she didn't know was that she was changing too. For the first time since her husband died years ago, she found herself laughing again. Talking again. Dreaming again. And it all began the night her little girl asked a stranger for leftovers. The candle in the dark that evening. The power went out. The storm outside howled, and the entire mansion was plunged into darkness. Grace lit a candle and carried it to the study where Robert sat. The flame's reflection danced in his eyes, painting the room in gold and shadow. "Looks like we're back to the old days," she said, setting the candle down. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes darkness isn't so bad. Makes the light easier to see." Jasmine came running in with a blanket, giggling. "It's like camping." They all laughed, and the sound soft, pure, and real. For that single moment, the mansion didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. Warm, whole, and filled with love. The morning miracle at dawn. The storm ended. Robert woke early, the first rays of sunlight slipping through the curtains. He tried to shift in his chair, Magen froze. He felt something. A tingling. A pulse. Movement. He looked down at his legs and saw his right foot twitch. His breath caught. He stared, eyes wide, tears flooding his vision. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was real. "Grace," he shouted, voice trembling. "Grace, come here." Grace burst into the room, panic on her face. "What's wrong?" He pointed, crying and laughing at once. "Look, my leg." It moved. She stared, then gasped. "Oh my God!" From behind her, Jasmine appeared, sleepy-eyed and smiling. "Told you, mister. Miracles happen. Robert laughed through tears, gripping the coin in his hand as the sunlight poured through the window. The house, once silent for years, now echoed with something it hadn't heard in decades, the sound of hope being reborn. The morning sunlight spilled over Harrison Manor like a blessing. For the first time in 2 decades, Robert Harrison felt alive. He sat by the window staring at his legs in disbelief. The faint twitch that had startled him yesterday morning hadn't been a dream. It happened again that night, and again this morning. It wasn't much, a spasm here, a flicker of movement there, but to a man who had been told he'd never move again, it was everything. Grace and Jasmine hovered near him, watching in awe as he willed his foot to move. The tiny motion sent shockwaves through the room. Jasmine clasped her hands together. "See? I told you your legs just forgot how to believe." Robert laughed through tears. "I don't understand it, but I'm not questioning it either." Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "This is impossible." Robert looked at her. "Maybe not. Maybe your daughter was right all along." A new dawn. Over the next several days, Robert's condition continued to improve. His doctors couldn't explain it. They ran tests, MRI scans, blood work, but the results made no sense. Medically speaking, "This shouldn't be happening," said Dr. Levin, the neurologist who had treated him for years. "Your spinal cord was completely severed, but somehow there's new nerve activity." Robert smiled faintly. "Maybe I just started believing again." The doctor frowned. "Belief doesn't heal tissue." "Maybe not," Robert replied. "But maybe it awakens something that can." Dr. Levin shook his head, baffled, but couldn't deny what the data showed. Robert didn't care about the science. For the first time since his accident, he felt the faint spark of possibility. Every day he pushed himself. Light therapy, assisted movement, focused will. Grace would help with his exercises while Jasmine cheered him on, clapping every time he managed even the slightest motion. "You're doing it, mister," she'd squeal. "See, I told you." He'd grin, sweat running down his face. "You're a tough coach, Jasmine." And she'd laugh, a sound that filled the once quiet mansion with pure joy. A hidden past, but as the days grew brighter for Robert, shadows began to stir in Grace's heart. She had accepted Robert's offer to live in the cottage behind his estate. It was warm, safe, and a world away from the crumbling apartment they'd come from. But she carried secrets, ones she prayed would never surface. Late one evening, after tucking Jasmine into bed, she stood by the window, staring at the moonlit snow. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded a letter she'd hidden in her coat pocket. It was from the hospital, dated 3 months ago. "Dear Ms. Thompson, following your last checkup, we regret to inform you that your condition has progressed. The tumor remains inoperable. Please consider scheduling palliative care." Tears blurred the words. Grace folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest. She had hidden the truth from Jasmine, and from Robert. She didn't have much time left. That's why she'd worked 3 jobs. That's why she'd pushed through every shift, every ache, every sleepless night, trying to build a safety net for her daughter before it was too late. And now, standing in the gentle light of the mansion that had become their refuge, she realized how cruel life could be, giving her hope just as her time was running out. The dinner table, a week later. Robert invited Grace and Jasmine to dinner inside the main house, something he hadn't done with anyone in 20 years. The dining hall, once cold and lifeless, glowed under crystal chandeliers. The table was set with fine china that hadn't been used since his wife left. "This feels like a dream," Grace whispered as she looked around. Robert smiled. "Dreams are only the first draft of miracles." They laughed, and for the first time in forever, the mansion echoed with warmth. Halfway through dinner, Robert surprised them both by saying, "Grace, I've been thinking about expanding the Harrison Foundation again. I want to focus on medical aid for families like yours. Single parents, struggling mothers, children who can't afford care." Grace blinked. "You do that?" "I want to help," he said softly. "Not out of guilt or money, but because I finally understand what real wealth means." Jasmine smiled proudly. "See, Mama? I told you he's a miracle man too now." Grace laughed, though her eyes shimmered with tears. "You're changing lives, Mr. Harrison." He met her gaze gently. "No, Grace, you and your daughter changed mine." A moment of truth. After dinner, Jasmine went upstairs to play, and Grace helped clear the dishes. Robert watched her in silence for a while, then said quietly, "Grace, are you all right?" She froze. "Why do you ask?" "You've been tired lately. I noticed the way your hands shake, the dark circles under your eyes. You're hiding something." Her throat tightened. It's nothing, just stress." Robert wheeled closer, his eyes searching hers. "Please don't lie to me." "Not you." Grace hesitated, then finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm sick, Robert." The room fell silent. She took a deep breath. "Cancer. The doctors say it's too late." Robert's face went pale. "No." She nodded, trembling. "I didn't want you or Jasmine to know. I didn't want pity." He shook his head, voice cracking. "Grace, and there has to be something we can do. I can pay for the best doctors, the best treatment." "It's not about money," she interrupted softly. "I've tried, it's already too far." Robert felt his world tilt. He had finally found light again, only to feel it slipping away. "Does Jasmine know?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Not yet. I can't break her heart." He swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of his wheelchair. "You gave me a miracle, Grace. Maybe I can give you one too." She smiled sadly. "You already have. You gave my daughter a home. That's more than I could have asked for." The night of prayers that night. Long after Grace and Jasmine had gone to sleep, Robert sat alone in his study, staring at the glowing coin on his desk. The angel engraving shimmered faintly under the moonlight. He clenched it in his hand. "If there's anyone up there, if any of this is real, don't take her. Take me instead. She's done nothing but good." His voice cracked. "I don't deserve miracles." "She does." The coin felt warm in his hand, the warmer than ever before. He closed his eyes, tears spilling down his cheeks, whispering again and again, "Please. Give her a miracle, please." The whisper in the dark. Around midnight, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Robert, half asleep in his chair, awoke to a faint sound. A voice. He blinked, heart pounding. "Who's there?" Then he saw her, Jasmine, standing in the doorway, barefoot, wearing her nightgown. But her face was different, calm, almost glowing in the dim light. "Jasmine?" he whispered. "What are you doing up?" She smiled softly. "You asked for a miracle, didn't you?" He froze. How did you know?" "The coin told me." He blinked, stunned. "What?" She stepped closer. "Mr. Harrison, miracles don't come from coins. They come from love. You believed again, and that belief can save her." He stared at her, trembling. "But how?" "Tomorrow," she said simply. "Take her to the hospital. Don't let her give up." Before he could answer, she turned and walked down the hall. He called after her, but she didn't respond. When he went to look, she was gone. He ran his hand over the coin. It was hot to the touch, glowing brighter than ever. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. The final plea at dawn, Robert rolled to the cottage and knocked on the door. Grace answered, startled to see him. "Robert, what's wrong?" He looked desperate, eyes wild with hope. "You have to come with me now, to the hospital." She frowned. "Why?" "Because I believe your miracle's waiting there." She hesitated, but something in his voice and the conviction, the fire, made her nod. Within an hour, they were at St. Mary's Hospital, the same place Grace had been diagnosed. Robert pulled every string he had, called in specialists, demanded new tests, paid for immediate imaging. Grace protested. "Robert, this isn't necessary." He cut her off gently. "Just let me believe, Grace, please." The unbelievable result. 2 hours later, Dr. Patel, the oncologist, returned with trembling hands and eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know how to explain this," she said slowly. "The scans show nothing. The tumor is gone." Grace's breath hitched. "Gone? Completely?" It's as if it was never there. The room went silent. Robert stared at her, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Do you still think miracles don't happen?" Grace collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Jasmine, clutching her mother's hand, whispered softly, "Told you, Mama, the coin worked." But Robert knew better. It wasn't the coin. It was faith reborn through love, the return of the miracle. That night, they returned to the mansion. Grace was weak from shock, but alive, truly alive. Robert sat alone later, holding the angel coin once more. Its glow had faded, but the engraving still read, "Believe again." He smiled. whispering to himself, "I do." And outside, under the shimmering blanket of stars, the wind carried the faintest echo of a child's laughter, the laughter that had brought a broken man back to life. The first light of dawn washed over Harrison Manor, painting the snow with a faint pink glow. The air felt alive, crisp with promise. Inside, Robert sat quietly by the fireplace. His hands trembled slightly as he held the angel coin, its surface worn smooth from being clutched so many times. He hadn't slept all night, not because of pain, but because he didn't feel any. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel pain. He flexed his toes beneath the blanket and they responded. His muscles, and weak but alive, obeyed. A tear slipped down his cheek. He whispered, "It's real. It's happening." And in his heart, he knew the miracle wasn't his alone. It belonged to her, the little girl who had knocked on his door one cold night, asking only for leftovers and leaving him with faith. A celebration of life that morning. Grace and Jasmine joined him for breakfast. The room felt brighter, filled with laughter and the smell of pancakes, Jasmine's favorite. Grace looked radiant, her illness gone, her cheeks flushed with color. She couldn't stop smiling, touching her heart every few minutes as if to make sure it still beat strong. "Dr. Patel called again this morning," she said. "They ran another scan just to confirm I'm completely clear." Robert smiled, his eyes warm. "I told you. You were meant to stay." Jasmine clapped her hands. "I knew it, see? I told you both miracles happen when you believe." Grace laughed, hugging her daughter close. "You were right, baby." Robert looked at them, the mother and daughter who had stepped into his world and turned his despair into purpose. For years he had lived surrounded by walls of gold but starved of love, and now, in their presence, he finally understood what real wealth meant. The walk of faith, that afternoon, with Grace's help, Robert made his way to the rehabilitation room in the manor, a space filled with old equipment, once abandoned, now dusted clean and ready. He placed both hands on the metal parallel bars. Breathing deeply, Grace stood nearby, holding Jasmine's hand. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Robert nodded. "I've waited 20 years for this." He looked down at his legs, fragile, unsteady, but no longer lifeless. Slowly, he lifted his right foot. It shook, trembled, and came down again with a faint thud. Then the left, Jasmine gasped. "Mama, he's doing it." Grace covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Robert's hands tightened around the bars as his knees wobbled. Every muscle screamed, but he pushed harder inch by inch. And then, for the first time in 20 years, he stood. Not perfectly. Not without struggle, but standing. The sunlight streaming through the window lit his face as he whispered, "Thank you, God." "Thank you." Jasmine ran to him, hugging his legs. "You did it, mister. You did it." He laughed through tears. "No, Jasmine. We did it." The foundation of miracles weeks passed, and the story of Robert's recovery and Grace's healing spread through the town like wildfire. Doctors couldn't explain it. The media called it the Harrison miracle, but Robert refused interviews. He didn't want fame. He wanted purpose. He reopened the Harrison Foundation, not as a business initiative, but as a sanctuary for hope. They provided funding for children's hospitals, cancer treatments, and rehabilitation centers for the disabled. Grace became the foundation's director, managing every project with quiet grace and determination. And Jasmine? She became its heart. The little girl who once begged for leftovers was now known as the Miracle Girl. Whenever people asked Robert about the secret behind his recovery, he'd simply smile and say, "A little girl taught me how to believe again." The return of the past one evening. As Robert practiced walking across his study, now using only a cane, he noticed something strange. The angel coin on his desk began to shimmer softly again, just like the night Grace was healed. He picked it up, curious. "Funny," he murmured. "I thought the miracle was done." Then he heard a voice, light, familiar, filled with warmth. "Miracles never end, mister. They just change form." He turned, startled. And there she was, Jasmine. But not the same little girl he saw every day. This Jasmine was radiant, surrounded by a faint golden glow, her curls dancing in an invisible breeze. "Jasmine," he whispered. She smiled. "You believed again, just like I said." He blinked. "But you're right here." Then he froze. He heard laughter from down the hall. The real Jasmine's laughter. echoing faintly as she played with her mother outside. He looked back. The glowing figure was still there, smiling peacefully. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "I told you once," she said. "If you ever needed a miracle, I'd give you one." Robert's breath caught. "You mean," she nodded. "The night I came to your door, I wasn't just a hungry girl. I was sent to remind you that faith still exists, that even a broken man can rise again when he loves and believes." Tears welled in his eyes. "You saved me," she smiled tenderly. "You saved yourself. All I did was knock." Then, slowly, she began to fade, her glow dissolving into the sunlight spilling through the window. Before vanishing completely, her voice whispered through the room, "Don't stop believing, mister. The world still needs miracles, and now you're one of them." The truth in the light, Robert fell to his knees, not in weakness, but in awe. His legs supported him. His heart felt full. Grace rushed in moments later, panicked. "Robert, are you okay?" He looked up at her, smiling through tears. "I'm perfect," she helped him to his feet. "You're standing—" He nodded. "I know, and I think I finally understand why." Grace frowned gently. "Why?" He took her hands in his, gazing into her eyes. "Because miracles don't come to fix us, and they come to show us we were never broken." She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. The legacy of belief months passed. The foundation grew. The mansion, once silent and cold, now buzzed with life. Volunteers, children, doctors, dreamers. Every wall echoed with laughter, music, and hope. And on the center table of the grand hall, enclosed in a glass case, sat the angel coin, no longer glowing, but sacred all the same. The plaque beneath it read, "Dedicated to the one who taught us to believe again, the little girl who promised a miracle." Visitors would ask about it, and Robert would smile and tell them the story of a lonely man, a hungry girl, and a promise made on a snowy night. He never mentioned the light or the voice or the vision. Some things, he believed, were meant to stay between heaven and the heart. The final miracle years later, on a spring morning, Robert walked unaided down the garden path where snow once fell thick. The air smelled of blossoms and new beginnings. Grace was waiting for him near the fountain, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes filled with peace. Jasmine, now grown and wearing a doctor's coat, stood beside her, the same bright smile lighting her face. She laughed. "See, mister? I told you I'd make people walk again." Robert chuckled, his eyes shining. "And you did. You made me walk." The three of them stood together under the soft sunlight, not as savior and saved, not as rich and poor, but as family. Robert glanced up at the sky, whispering a quiet thank you to the little angel who had knocked on his door all those years ago. And just as he did, a gentle wind stirred the blossoms around them, carrying the faint sound of a child's laughter, familiar, eternal, and full of light.